everybody, it's me, Beth Maitland of Drama Queen Bee Quilts, and it's sort of my double life. We're coming to you from my sound booth at Sony Pictures, where I'm doing my day job, and I'm going to narrate shortly the demonstration of my long arm quilting of a jungle fern border on a kid's quilt. Let's get to work. Okay, first of all, I'm at the very bottom edge of my border on a little kid's quilt that I'm working on, and this is the Jungle Fern border. It's for a boy, so it's a little less feminine than feathers, and it's a little fun and funky and modern, so it's just perfect. So we'll bring up our bobbin thread, take a few tacking stitches, and the first thing we need to do is make our spine. So what we'll do is we are attaching to the work that we've already done. We're making sure that we leave room for a nice curve around the corners, and then we just meander in a little curved sort of serpentine spine back and forth, and as we approach the next corner, we want to make sure that we leave plenty of room to go around that corner again with a nice scoop. And then as we come back into the work we've already done, we want to make sure that our spine lines up with the previous work. We take a couple of tacking stitches, and then we're on to the next. You may have noticed at the very end of that last shot that my thread was shredding, and part of that is because I was sewing from right to left. Most long arm machines prefer to be sewn from left to right, and it has to do with the timing, the needle going down into the bobbin case, catching the bobbin and coming back up. They are sort of timed to go one direction from left to right, and so a lot of quilters will tell you that when you're planning your work, try to always plan your major sewing from the left to the right, which is why we did our spine, just that single line of quilting from right to left, so that by the time we came back, we didn't have to change thread. We didn't have to break thread, come back up and do something else. I planned it that way so that we could do the work from one side to the other. So now you can see we're just making a back and forth motion, and it's parallel lines. Doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be completely the same distance apart, but I use the foot of my machine to give me a general idea of how wide a spacing to put between the two. That foot is about 1/4 of an inch wide, and so that if I use that foot as a guideline, I can get 1/4 of an inch pretty close to parallel lines, and we go back and forth up to the spine and up to the sewing line, up to the spine, up to the sewing line. And on this upper section with this border next to the piecing, we want to get as close to the sewing line as we can. That's going to be different when we come around in the other direction to go back. On the bottom of the stem, we're going to leave some room, and I'll talk about that when we get there. So, I also want to take a moment to give props out to Lynn Durbin of Camlin Quilts. She's the one that first taught me this cute, modern, masculine, sort of funky design, the Jungle Fern. She uses it a lot on her long arm quilting projects, and so I want to give a shout out and give some credit to Lynn Durbin of Camlin Quilts. In addition, we're now in the corner. You'll want to look at our spacing. We're starting to make the back and forth lines more like wedges. We need to turn that corner. So we want to think about that as we're approaching it and sort of space things out a little bit so it's more like a wedge, so it turns that corner. And now we're approaching the work that's already done. We want to be able to eyeball it as we come closer so that we don't overlap stitching or get too close. And we're done with that direction. As you can see, without breaking thread, without cutting anything or changing our quilting, we're now going straight across the spine and into the back and forth lines again, the parallel lines, back and forth, directly onto the bottom section of the border. You can see that this is the edge of my quilt, and so we need to leave room. When we're getting toward the edge, we need to leave room for our binding. Again, as we come into the corner, we're going to make wedge shapes so that we can certainly continue the basic design theme, but that we get that corner turned and get back to the spot where it's just back and forth lines again. Again, we want to leave at least 1/4 of an inch for our binding, and I usually leave just a little bit more than that still so that I don't ever square up the quilt and then cut into my stitching. I do leave, I would say, more like 1/2 an inch between the bottom stitching right there and the outer edge of the binding. One of the most challenging things for me is to try to figure out what my quilt path is going to be to cut thread as infrequently as possible, which is why doing the Jungle Fern in this direction, starting with the spine right to left, then left to right for the upper border, and then right to left again for the lower border, keeps me from breaking thread. You could conceivably break thread 3 times for each of those passes, but if you figure it out and take your time and plan ahead, the least number of thread cuts will save you lots of time in your long arm project. Another question that a lot of my students and people that communicate with me online will ask is whether to sew the border before or after doing the quilting on the piecing center of the quilt. For me, I stabilize everything, sew down the edges as I advance the quilt. So I make sure and mount the quilt vertically using my channel locks on my long arm machine. And I make sure that that quilt is mounted at the top of the work field. And then I just keep stabilizing as I go, as I advance the quilt and go down the project. And so the border situation is after I've stabilized. So even though I have not quilted the triangles and the piecing, I have quilted them up into the last advancing of the quilt. So it doesn't get ruffling and puckers and any kind of problematic overstitching or pleats, as long as I just keep everything tacked down, stabilized, and just be really, really mindful. So now just some tacking stitches and we're done.